Hi, my name is Kerry Critchlow from RCR Recording Studios, and today we're going to be talking about kind of how and when to use modes or how they can be useful in your music production. So in a previous video, we've discussed what they are and how you can kind of go about figuring out what scales to play and how they're put together, the formulas, the scale degrees, and the various examples of whether you're sticking in a single key, for instance, the key of C here, or whether you're using modal interchange, which is you're starting the scale on the same note, which is C, but how each of the scales differs as compared to our C major scale, our Ionian scale. So a question that I've been mulling about for a long time, and I've done a lot of research into this, and I'm still not sure I've really found a great answer to this question, but I'm going to do my best to explain what I believe the case is. But what is the difference between, say, using an Ionian scale versus a Lydian scale, or when would you use an Ionian scale versus a Lydian scale? How do you know you're using a Lydian scale, for instance, a C Lydian scale, as opposed to just playing in the key of G, which only has, one sharp, and that sharp is F, as we, discussed last week with our circle of fifths? Or how do we know that we're, playing a C Dorian mode as opposed to just playing a melody in the key of B flat? Because if we look at our sheets, and this should look familiar if you've been with us for a while. This is a major scale example sheet here. This lists out kind of some of the more important concepts when it comes to your major scale. Here's the formula. Here are the sevenths. Here are the numbers of the chords. These are the chords within the key, the notes you can use within the key, and the numerical system. So for instance, in the key of C, which this is C major, the one chord is a C major. The two chord is a D minor. The three chord is an E minor. The four chord is an F. The fifth chord is a G. The sixth chord is an A minor. The seventh is a B diminished. And then we come back to the eight, or the one again, which is a C major. And we can figure out what chords belong in each, or which notes belong in each of these chords by looking at our numerical system. For instance, we know that if we essentially just kind of skip every other note, that will tell us what notes belong in our chord. So for C, if we do one, skip, then we have E, skip, and then we have G. C, E, and G make up our C major chord, or 1, 3, 5. For a D minor, we can start on D and say D is 1, skip, 3 for F, 4, 5 for A. A D minor is a D, an F, and an A. An E minor would be an E, a G, and a B. An F would be an F, A, and C. G would be G, B, and D. A minor would be A, C, and E. And a B diminished would be a B, a D, and an F. And then we're back to C, which is a C, E, and G. You can use any of these notes over any of these chords, and generally speaking, they're going to sound pretty good. Now, with that in mind, there are a few things maybe to keep in mind when you are crafting your melodies. For instance, the most compatible notes within any of these chords are going to be the notes that make up the chords. So if you're playing a C, the three safest chords to play over a C are going to be C, E, and G. The three safest notes to play over a D minor are going to be a D, F, and A. The three safest notes to play over an E minor are going to be E, G, and B. Now, you can use any of these notes over any of these chords, and generally speaking, it's going to sound okay, but some notes are going to sound a little bit more in line, if you will, when you're crafting these melodies. And so you might say that the strongest note of any of these is probably going to be the one or whatever chord you're playing, that note. So if you're playing a C, the strongest note that you can play would be a C, right? It's going to have the most resonance because it's the same note as the chord. But you can get away with any of these notes, and sometimes you might use passing notes or any sorts of things, right? You can also think in intervals. So when you're playing a C note, these are the scale degrees are the intervals right between it, going from a 1 to a 2, or going from a 1 to a 3, or going from a 1 to a 4. And you can think of it in terms of those intervals. You can kind of use that kind of thought process as well. Where modes are going to come in is kind of dependent on what your starting chord is in any given key. So in the key of C, if your starting chord is a C major, the 1, then chances are it's gonna feel like the home base in that key. It's gonna feel like the place that you want to end up at, right? So if you start on a C and then you go to, say, an E minor and then maybe a G, and then wherever else you go, at some point you're ultimately going to want to end up back at C. C is going to feel the most, like I said, at home. And so if you're playing in the key of C and you start on C, chances are Ionian is probably going to be the best general feel for your chord progression or for your melody when it comes to C, and that's just the C major scale, right? If you're starting on D, your melody might have more of a Dorian feel, and that's just emphasizing the home feel, if you will. And so let's just give a quick example so that we're all kind of on the same page. So if we bring up a piano here, and if some of you may notice this DAW looks a little bit different than it did last video, and that's because we updated the DAW recently, and so there are a few visual differences, but it's basically the same. But let's start with like a C chord, a progression in the key of C, and we'll start our progression on C. And then maybe we'll just do to like an E minor. And then maybe back to a C, just to keep it simple. And if we start our melody on C, and this is just a C major scale over this chord progression. And we'll just have that maybe just come back down again. Actually, it might be better to do it this way. Okay. And so that's an Ionian scale over this C major progression. And that's giving kind of this, sort of happier kind of vibe, right? If we're thinking in terms of Ionian, you kind of want to have your note kind of feel like it wants to land on C, or emphasize this C major kind of feel. And you can also kind of look at where the half steps are as well to figure out kind of where the feel is coming from. And so in Ionian, the half steps are on are between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8, or the 1, or in this case, the half steps would be between E and F and B and C. So E and F, you can see that they're right next to each other, and B and C are right next to each other. Now, if we want to give it, say, a Dorian feel, what we're going to want to do is probably start our chord progression on D minor, because Dorian is the second mode. And so you would start your scale, if you're in the key of C, you would start on the second degree, or the second chord, right? And so you have C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished, C. Well, D minor is the Dorian mode in C major, or D Dorian, if you will. And the D Dorian scale is going to sound the best over your minor chords because it's a minor mode, but it's going to sound the absolute best over this D minor. And so if you start your chord progression on a D minor, and you can do the same kind of thing here. So we did a 1, 3, 1. Well, if in D Dorian you're making D minor kind of your 1 chord, then F would be your 3 chord, and then back to D minor. And so we can say D minor, and then we'll do an F chord. And then back to D minor. And these are very basic, simple examples. There's other ways that you can kind of think about this sort of thing, but these are like just kind of some more simplistic examples to get you kind of thinking kind of in the same terms. So we still have the same interval. We're doing a 1 to a 3, but we're doing it instead of starting on C, we're starting on D minor. Now we're using all the same notes because we're still in the key of C. All right, and then this would be a D Dorian and a 1, 3, 1 chord progression. All right, but it has a sadder feel than our Ionian, right? It's got a little bit more sadness happening. All right, and that's because Dorian is a minor mode. There's you can think of it kind of this way. There's 3 major modes, which is Ionian, Lydian, and Mixolydian, because they don't have a flat third. Then there's technically 3 minor modes, which would be Dorian, Phrygian, and Aeolian. And then Locrian would be considered a diminished mode because it has a flat 3 and a flat 5. It's the only one that has both a flat 3 and a flat 5 in it, which gives it that diminished feel. But I tend to think of anything with a flat third as definitionally a minor mode. And so you can think of a diminished chord kind of as a minor chord, but we're adding in the flat 5 on top of the flat 3. So Lohengrin, you can think of it either as a diminished or as a minor. I think you're probably going to be okay no matter which way you, whether you think of it as one or the other or both. So you can think of it as there's 3 majors, 3 minors, and a diminished, or you can say there's 3 majors and 4 minors. And I think you'd be mostly correct either way. But you can kind of get the idea that this Dorian scale sounds a little bit sadder. And when we play this scale over our D minor chord and make D minor chord kind of our home base where we want to end up at, it gives us a different feel. It gives us kind of this sadder feel, right? And again, we can do this with all of the modes, and I guess we might as well since we're here. So the next mode would be, you would start on your E minor, and then if we're looking at our sheet, so E minor is the 3rd chord in our progression, and it's the 3rd mode. And so if we make E minor our home base in the key of C, it's going to give more of a Phrygian feel. And so we can do the same thing. We can do a 1 to 3, so an E minor to a G, and then end on E minor. And so these are all very simple, basic examples, and they're all relatively the same, if that makes sense. The intervals are all relative. Okay, and so this is going to be a Phrygian feel. We're doing an E minor to a G to an E minor, or in Phrygian, we're doing a 1, 3, 1 in a Phrygian mode, and we're playing E Phrygian, which is and this is all in the key of C. And this is going to sound even darker and more melancholy than the Dorian scale. This is probably a second most dark of all the modes. But you see how it kind of wants to come back to E, right? Because this E note is sort of like the home base, and it wants to kind of come back to this E minor. And so you're when you're playing in a whatever mode you're choosing, you want it to feel like you want to end up kind of on the home chord, and that's going to give you the feel that you want. And we'll get into that more into that detail a little bit. Then we have F and A minor. And then we'll move our scale. Okay, and this is going to be a Lydian mode in starting on F, which is the 4th, and Lydian is the 4th degree, or the 4th mode of our major scale. And so we have Lydian, F Lydian in the key of C, and our starting chord is the 4 chord, the F. And this is going to give us kind of that Lydian feel when we play the F Lydian scale over our 1, 3, 1 chord progression in Lydian. That's got a bit of a happier feel to it, generally speaking. Okay. And if we look at our mode thing, I've added kind of this kind of dark, bright scale, or like you can think happy, sad maybe even, but The brightest of all of the scales is probably going to be your Lydian. It's going to kind of have this otherworldly sort of ethereal sound. You're going to hear Lydian most commonly in like in like orchestral compositions, like movie soundtracks, things like that. Lydian is going to be very popular in like film scores and things like that. You don't tend to hear Lydian very often in like pop or rock or things like that. But it's got this kind of happy, otherworldly thing. But 1 is the brightest, 7 is the darkest. So 1 is going to be your Lydian on this scale. 2, the second brightest, the second happiest, the second kind of whatever is going to be your Ionian scale. The 3rd is going to be your Mixolydian. The 4th is going to be your Dorian, and this is where it starts getting kind of more sad sounding because this is where your minor scales kind of start coming in with the flat 3rd. So you have like the Dorian scales, the Dorian scale. Then you have your Aeolian, which is pretty sad, and that's at 5. Then you have Phrygian, which is a little darker, a little moodier than Aeolian. And then you have Locrian, which is going to be the darkest and kind of saddest, oddest sounding scale. But we'll continue our example here. So we have our Lydian, which is kind of having that bright sound. Now we're going to go to Mixolydian, which will also tend to have a brighter sound to it. And this would be, if we're doing our 1-3, it's going to be a G to our B diminished, and then back to our G. And again, we're keeping these super simple. We're doing a 1-3-1 chord progression, and we're just playing out the scales. Okay, and so this is going to be a G major to a B diminished to a G major, a 1-3-1, and we're playing a Mixolydian scale, and this is all in the key of C. That's got a bit of a bright feel too, even though, again, we're keeping it all relative. 1-3-1 chord progression in G Mixolydian. We're playing a G Mixolydian scale. Okay, that's got a bit of a bright, kind of happier feel, but a little bit bluesy too. Okay, and then we're going to go to an Aeolian, and this is going to be a bit sadder of a thing, but it's going to be an A minor to a C, which is again a 1-3, so a 1 to a 3 to a 1. And hopefully this is making sense. I'm not saying that the only time you can play these scales is when you're playing on these chords or even just starting on these chords, but it's the easiest way to kind of approach getting the feel of the modes that you want to use. And you can use the modes to kind of create the feeling or vibe that you want to give your music. Now, chances are, in all reality, that if you've been making music long enough, that you've probably unknowingly used these concepts without realizing that you're doing them. For instance, if you're playing in the key of C and you start on an A minor chord in the key of C, chances are you're playing that natural minor, you're using an Aeolian or a natural minor feel, and it's going to make your music have a little bit more of a sadder kind of tone to it, right? Conversely, if you're, Ionian would be if you're starting on the one chord. So if you start your chord progression in the key of C on a C, chances are you've used an Ionian feel with your melody. If you started your chord progression on a D minor in the key of C, chances are you've probably given your song a Dorian feel. If you started your chord progression on E minor in the key of C, chances are you've given it a Phrygian sort of feel, and vice versa. Although these are not hard, fast rules, right? There's you can start you can start your chord progression on any of these and give it any of the feels, right? But it's just the easiest way to go about doing this. And that's your Aeolian or your natural minor. And then last would be the Locrian mode. And this is going to have the darkest feel of everything. And it would be a B to a D minor, or a B diminished to a D minor, to keep our 1-3-1 going. And this is going to be the darkest of all the scales. It's also the least used. Because generally speaking, the only time you're going to use a Locrian mode is over diminished chords, generally. All right, and so here would be a Locrian feel. Okay, and that's a 1-3-1 chord progression. And so we've kind of done the same thing. It's the same interval, a 1-3-1 in all of the modes, and then just played an ascending and descending scale in that mode, right? And so you kind of get a feel for all of these. Now, if you start your chord progression on C major in the key of C, let's just assume that we're just going to stay in the key of C for today. If you are starting your chord progression on C major or the 1, generally speaking, Ionian is going to be kind of where it's going to feel the most natural, because you're going to want to end up on that C, right? C is going to feel like your home base. Conversely, if you start on a D minor, Dorian or the D minor, the D is going to feel like your home base, and so your melody is probably going to end or start on that D. It's going to want to feel like it's going to end up there, right? And I don't know how well this concept is kind of hitting. Like I said, I'm still kind of learning along with all of you, so I'm not going to say pretend that I fully understand every use case, but I will say that if you want to give your song a certain feel or a certain vibe, then these modes are a good way to kind of push in that direction. So, for instance, if you want a very, very bright, kind of otherworldly, happy kind of a sound, then Lydian is probably what you're going to want to do. And Lydian is always going to sound best over the 4 chord of whatever key you're in. So if you're in the key of C, your 4 chord is going to be F, and your F chord is going to be the easiest to give your Lydian sound to, right? Another thing I may want to bring up, I suppose, is that most often in songs, you're not sticking to one mode throughout the entire song. You are probably actually switching modes as you switch chords, right? As you go. So when you're on a C major, there's a very good chance you're playing Ionian, and then when you're playing an E minor, you might unwittingly or wittingly move to a Phrygian mode, because Phrygian you can play over that E minor. Hopefully this is making sense. So you can think of it as like the chord you're playing, you can use that mode over whatever chord that happens to be. So if you're playing in C, if you're playing a C chord, you can play your C Ionian. or you can, and then if you play a D minor, you can use your D Dorian. If you're playing an E minor, you can play an E Phrygian. If you're playing an F, you can use an F Lydian, and you can change mode every single chord change if you wanted to, right? And so it's not likely that you're keeping the same mode throughout the entire song. You're probably switching it up between chord changes, or depending what chord you're on, might determine what mode you're using. And that's because each chord kind of has notes that are going to feel like they really go good with them, and other notes that might clash a little bit. And so, yeah, hopefully this is all making sense. But you can use the modes to kind of give yourself a sense of what sort of vibe or feeling or mood do I want to give my song. If I want a kind of a middle of the road, literally a middle of the road sort of sadder kind of thing, then Dorian is probably what you want to use. If you want to give yourself kind of a happier but not super happy kind of thing, you might want to go with a Mixolydian, right? And that might also indicate what chord you want to start on within your key. So if you know that G is the if you know that G is the chord you want to start on, and you want to play in the key of C, that's going to allow you to give it a Mixolydian sort of feel, right? And that'll give you sort of that vibe. So, well, I mean, like, let's do that real quick. So let's start. Let's create a chord progression here, and we're going to start it on G, which means it's probably going to want to end on G as well. And then maybe to an F. And then maybe to a C. And we can just have that repeat. But since we're starting on G and we're playing in the key of C, this Mixolydian sort of melody, meaning we're starting our melody or at least ending our melody on that G chord, is going to feel very appropriate, since it's going to feel like where we want to end up. And so like maybe our song would end on this G. Okay, and so our melody, a good place to start, or to think about starting, would be maybe having this G. Forgot where I was in the song. Okay. And so this would be sort of a brighter, happier sort of vibe. And we're using sort of a Mixolydian mode to work with them because we're kind of like making G sort of our home base, our home note. Okay, and I don't know, this is a very simple melody, very simple chord progression and all that, but hopefully you're getting kind of the idea. You want to give it a happier sort of vibe, but maybe adding kind of that more bluesy sound with the F. And another thing you could do is emphasize the F in your melody, because that's sort of like that flat 7 is sort of what's giving it that bluesy or like Mixolydian quality. Okay. And then, wrong one. You can maybe add in this F to kind of give it that dominant 7 sound, which is, again, that Mixolydian sound, that dominant sound. Okay, and so that's kind of more of your Mixolydian sort of vibe. If you wanted to give it more of that sadder characteristic, we can maybe try a Dorian chord progression, which would be in the key of C. We're going to want to either start, like, generally speaking, kind of the first chord you're using is sort of what's going to feel like the chord you want to end on. This is not always the case, but often is. And so if we start our chord progression on a D minor, which is the second mode in our C major scale, then D Dorian is going to feel like a pretty good scale, right? Or like melodic framing to use. Maybe have that run a couple of times here. And then we'll end on our D minor. Okay, and what we're doing is a D minor to a G to an F to a G. And we can start our melody. We don't even have to start our melody on D. We're just it's gonna feel like we're gonna want to end on D. So maybe we have. And maybe let's start it up an octave because of reasons. Excuse me. Okay. And that's given kind of a sadder vibe. And a little bit more of a Dorian sort of thing. And it becomes even more obvious if you start your okay. And so you can sort of use these concepts of modes to sort of put you in a ballpark of sort of a vibe that you want to kind of go for. Same thing if you want to play in a more of a Phrygian mode, you can start your chord progression on an E minor. In the key of C. And then maybe just back to an E minor. And again, sometimes you're going to be switching modes depending on what chord you're on, right? So if you're starting on E minor, your Lydian or your Phrygian might be a good. Okay, and so a little bit darker here. And again, like the modes are probably going to switch between chords. A lot of times you're not always going to stay in one mode throughout an entire song, but you can give the concept of the modes will kind of lead you in a direction of, you know, what kind of maybe mood you want to set, right? And again, if you want to set the happiest, brightest, kind of more otherworldly, ethereal, whatever kind of thing, you're probably going to want to use a Lydian. The second brightest is going to be your Ionian. Third is going to be Mixolydian. Fourth is going to be Dorian. Fifth is going to be Aeolian. Sixth is going to be Phrygian. And Locrian is going to be the darkest, right? For general everyday use, if you're writing kind of more pop rock, more what you might call standard sort of radio sort of songs, Ionian, Dorian, Mixolydian, and Aeolian, those four keys are probably going to be, or modes rather, not keys. Those four modes are probably going to be the most popular and the easiest to use in those types of music. Phrygian, Lydian, and Locrian are all going to be a little bit more special use case, but you can use them, especially in more, say, like jazz or like film scores, things like that. They're going to set more of those darker, well, in the case of Lydian, very bright, but these sort of more extreme sort of feelings, right, when it comes to the music. But if you're going for generally happy, Ionian and Mixolydian. If you're going for generally sad, Dorian and Aeolian are going to be your modes of choice. And those are going to be the most popular when you're writing your music for the most part. So if you were going to learn any of the modes, Ionian, Dorian, Mixolydian, and Aeolian are probably going to be your best bet when it comes to writing basic songs that you might hear on the radio. If you're trying to get a little bit deeper into creating more extreme moods or going into like classical composition or jazz or whatever, Phrygian, Lydian, and Locrian might be more up your alley. But you can use these concepts to kind of center yourself emotionally, right? Or at least understand what melodies can be played and when. Like your Phrygian melodies can be played over the third sort of interval. So if you're playing in the key of C, anytime you have an E minor, a Phrygian is going to be very much appropriate, but not necessary. You don't have to play a Phrygian mode over that E minor. But you can switch between the modes as you're sort of going along, and kind of you can think in these terms as far as pushing your song in a certain emotional direction, right? But you don't have to think in these terms at all. Like I said, you don't actually have to know any of this at all. As a matter of fact, I still don't fully understand it myself, and hopefully I'm doing an okay job explaining the concepts here. But just because you don't, if you don't know these concepts, that's not going to be able to stop you from writing amazing music, right? My philosophy has always been, start somewhere, pick one of these, chords, or one of these notes or whatever, and play it, and then play another one after it, and then if that sounds good, then keep going. If not, go back to the first chord and then try another chord after it, or go back to the first note and try another note after it, and play with it and move it around until it's giving you the feeling that you think it ought to have, right? Because at the end of the day, your music is about expressing the emotion you want to express, and these modes can be a tool to maybe help you get there a little quicker once you understand them to a degree, but you don't need to know them in order to kind of just play around with these notes and see what happens when you play them, right? If you want a sadder sort of song, then start on a minor chord in whatever key you can, in the key of C. D minor, E minor, and A minor will all give you more of a sad kind of vibe, generally speaking, especially if you play them more often. Whereas C, F, and G are all, the 1, the 4, and the 5 are all going to give you more of that happier, brighter kind of sound. 2, 3, and 6 are going to give you that sadder sound. And this B diminished, or the 7, is generally speaking a special use case, but they're all kind of have their place depending on what you're trying to accomplish, right? Hopefully this is making sense. Now, we might dive deeper into the individual modes in the future. We'll see. I'm not sure how necessary it really is. I think once you have a kind of understanding of what's going on, or what, kind of just the idea that when we're talking about modes, we're really just talking about scales. Sometimes you can use those scales or relate them to chord progressions or things like that, but it's not really necessary. Oftentimes you're going to be using these concepts without even understanding modes at all. And modes are going to be probably most helpful, generally speaking, when it comes to improvisational types of things. So if you're in a jazz trio or something along those lines or whatever, these modes might give you an indication of when you can play certain notes over what chords, or things like that, right? So if you're in the key of C, for instance, and you're playing an F chord, well, playing an F, G, A, B is going to give you a Lydian sound over that F major chord, right? So if we were to play this F major, and then we were to play so we're playing an F major chord, and then we're playing this kind of Lydian thing with the sharp 4 here. And then if we hit that A minor, and back to our F. And then we have the end on the 3rd there. This is giving both kind of a Lydian feel, but it's making it kind of sadder, right? And so, like I said, understanding the modes is not going to be 100% necessary, but hopefully this is giving you a little bit more insight. And if you are trying to push a certain, or not push, but like trying to create a certain emotional vibe in your music, maybe this is giving you a little bit of framing on how you can go about it. But again, in my personal opinion, or at least what's worked for me, is really just kind of think of it in terms of major, happy, minor, sad, and then you can kind of juxtapose those emotions or go between them. You can have a melody that sounds happy at spots or sad at spots or whatever, and chances are you're using these concepts, whether you're conscious of it or not, just by the mere kind of exploration of the music you're doing anyways. And so, like I said, we may at some point get a little bit more into detail on the modes and things like that. And these are just the major modes. There's also minor modes. So if we were to, say, bring up a minor video, or our minor theory here, or well, I mean, melodic or harmonic, right? Well, these have different modes, right? So if we're playing an A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A for our melodic minor scale, or A melodic minor, well then the second mode would be playing a B, C, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A, and then ending on B, right? And that's going to give you a melodic minor mode. And so there's so much out there that you can kind of look into and get into and explore when it comes to music. But hopefully this is giving you kind of just a basic understanding of modes and where they can kind of come in useful or handy for you as far as structuring some emotional and purposefulness behind your music or whatever. But like I said, you don't need to know any of this to write amazing melodies that are given exactly the emotional context that you want to give. So my best, I would suggest just playing some chords, playing some notes, and seeing, if you like them, and if not, change them around, and knowing kind of this circle of fifths, or like kind of how all of these chords relate with one another, the basics, the fundamentals of all of this stuff is going to get you there the quickest, because you can say any of these notes are going to work over any of these chords, and I can put any of these chords in any order I want and play around with it until it sounds like it's what I want it to sound like. One other thing I might want to look at, we talked about the circle of fifths last week. One thing I sort of forgot to mention is that the relationship also within the circle of fifths is going to give you your chords within the key as well. So if you're in the key of C, here's your one chord. Well, your two chord is going to be down and to the left, or the minor, right? C. Your two chord is D. Your three chord is down and to the right, so that's your E minor. Your four chord is to the left. Your five chord is to the right, and your six chord is directly beneath it. And your seven chord is going to be skip one and to the right, and it's the diminished version of that. It's also the furthest away from this group, and so it's going to sound the most odd, right? But the same thing is true with, for instance, B flat. If you're in the key of B flat, well, your one chord is B flat. Your two chord is down to the left, which is C. Your three chord is down and to the right, which is D. Your four chord is your E flat. Your five chord is your F. And your six chord is right underneath with this G. And your diminished is over here. So it would be an A diminished in the key of B flat. And this works for any of these. And so you can gain a lot of information from the circle of fifths at a glance, right? And you can kind of see that these chords are all kind of grouped together, and they're all going to kind of work together, right? Your C, your A minor, your D minor, your E minor, your G, your F, these are all going to work really well together. And then your B diminished here is going to be kind of your seven chord. It's going to be kind of a special use case, and we might get into when that is appropriate in the future. But same thing with A. If A is if you're in the key of A major, well, hey, B minor, C sharp minor, F sharp minor, D, E. All of these chords are going to fit together, right? If you're in A flat, all of these are going to kind of fit together. Your A flat, C minor, F minor, D flat minor, or B flat minor rather, D flat and E flat. All of these are going to kind of fit together, right? And so that's another kind of useful ways that when it comes to your keys, whatever key you're starting on, directly to the left, directly to the right, and the 3 chords below, directly to the left, and directly to the right, all of these are going to be working within that key. Okay, so that's another use case for your circle of fifths that we didn't cover last week, but probably should have. And I think with that, we're going to leave it. Hopefully, with you have a better understanding of modes and when they can be used and how you can use them to set emotional tones. You kind of have an understanding of which ones are going to give you happier or sadder vibes. You have an idea of, generally speaking, when they might come into play, and that you are also, generally speaking, going to move in and out of the modes as you're playing through your chord changes and things like that. You're not necessarily sticking to one mode as you're playing the whole song, right? You can have passages where you might move between one or the other, and that's perfectly fine. And hopefully this is going to help you to write some more interesting melodies and give you some more ideas on how you can structure your music in a way that is going to give the emotional tone that you want to give. And with that, I hope you have yourselves a great day, a great week, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.